Why did you come to this session about creating calm, supportive environments for children with Tourette syndrome? Lauren was really kind and gave me options of different things that I wanted to talk about. And one of the things that I'm passionate about is about how do we support children that might be marginalised within the school community. Tourette's in particular is something where people might feel quite marginalised for lots of different reasons, and there's lots of overlaps with other examples in neurodiversity. But also, you are less likely to be diagnosed as a woman with Tourette syndrome. So, what I try and do is if I'm given an option to be a woman and be authentic and be present as myself, is to say, actually, as a woman with Tourette's, I can do all of this. So I mentioned some of my credentials at the beginning. So it's also to represent the idea that people with Tourette's can do many different things. Lauren, can I ask, whilst people are hopefully typing, what made you think that Tourette's was an important part of the overall kind of webinar series?
Sorry, I'm unmuting myself, Sarah. When you proposed this idea, honestly, I haven't been in other learning that we focus on Tourette's. And so when you proposed it, I was like, this is fantastic because this is something that I have not seen spoken about in the international world. I'm largely working with international schools. So I think this is really important learning that a lot of us are unfamiliar with. But I also felt like it's applicable beyond just students and people with Tourette's. So the learning we are learning today is about creating calm environments for all of our kids, as is true with anything we're doing for neurodivergent children, right? It's good for other children in our classrooms, and the practices are best practices. So I just saw a lot of value across the board, but also I have not been in a learning session specifically about Tourette's in the international world. So I was really happy to see that proposal actually.
But what we're looking at today is about creating calm, supportive environments. And it's about really thinking about establishing that inclusive school environment for students with Tourette syndrome. And in the chat, people are talking about now what practically can we do, but also those broader ideas about actually what might work with some children with Tourette syndrome might also work with children who are autistic or have obsessive compulsive disorder and so on. And what I introduced was saying, actually, I was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome when I was 27 years old. And I've been a senior leader in schools for over 20 years. And that's included psychiatric inpatient services, so children that might be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anorexia nervosa, and so on. I'm also an author of several books on themes of social and emotional mental health. And excitingly, I'm also the co-chair of the emotional well-being track at the Kazakhstan World Congress as well. So, really, really exciting times. So let's start with the basics about what Tourette syndrome is. So Tourette syndrome isn't something that you can help. It's not something that you plan to do or that you are trying to make a fuss or get people to look at you. It's a neurological disorder, and we aren't quite sure about why it exists or why it happens, but it's characterized by what's called involuntary motor tics, so physical actions, and vocal tics, so the things that you might see and hear, and we'll talk about what they are and what they look like in a moment. There are loads and loads of overlaps with a range of different needs. And some of those needs are kind of typically what you would consider neurodiverse needs. And I think it's the wonderful jigsaw puzzle of humanity that we are so different in lots of different ways. You are more likely to also have things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, autistic spectrum disorder, lots of disorders in here, but this I'm using medical terms rather than necessarily how I feel about it, anxiety and depression as well. So in the spirit of being very honest and transparent and things like that as well, I've had obsessive compulsive disorder for a number of years. And obsessive compulsive disorder is characterized with a range of different things. It's not just about switching lights on and off or just being clean. For me, my friend died in a motorbike accident 16 years ago now, and I would always retell the story of him surviving that motorbike accident, and only if I'd written a message to him in a certain way would he have lived. And then I would then recreate that story with my other friends to make sure they didn't die. OCD can be really challenging, really, really difficult. And if you think about Tourette syndrome and OCD, and I've also got a history of depression as well, you can see how that can be particularly problematic for your schooling community. Not just your children, but you might also have adults with those same needs working with your children as well. And how do we make sure that there's a safe space for everybody? Many of you would have heard of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Some people talk about the idea about being wound up by a motor and having to do things and having to be active as well. Also, anxiety, feeling concerned and worried about doing things, going to school, making mistakes. It could be about talking to friends and saying the wrong thing. And we all might show it in lots and lots of different ways. So, what is Tourette syndrome in particular? Well, one of the things that I said was motor tics and vocal tics. You have to have both of those things for it to be considered Tourette syndrome. You can't just have motor tics and you can't just have vocal tics. You might not see them all at the same time either. They come and they go. But motor tics might be things like blinking excessively, obviously not just blinking normally. It might be things like wrinkling the nose, and that's one of mine. I quite often do that. And it might be grimacing. So you might think, oh, that child has pulled a face at me. And actually, it becomes apparent that it's actually more of a tic. It's not necessarily them responding to you socially in that sort of way. It could also be things like touching things. So, for example, one of the things that I might do is I might touch someone's shoulder, or I might just poke their nose really kind of gently and things like that. Or if I'm particularly anxious or worried about things, it might just be kind of like hitting out and those sorts of things. And that can obviously be quite uncomfortable for lots of different reasons. There is no sense of wanting to hurt somebody or irritate somebody or anything like that. It's just inside me and it has to come out. And sometimes people describe it like a sneeze. And when you really, really, really want to sneeze and you try and stop it, and sometimes you manage it, but sometimes you don't. Sometimes people talk about tics in that way as well. Vocal tics are things such as noises, like it might be, for me, it might be squeaks, or it might be phrases that I might say. It could be grunting, it could be shouting. It might be specific to the situation as well. So, for example, one of the things, if I go through airports, for example, my vocal tics are really loud, and it's very particular for my environment. So I might claim all manner of different things whilst going through an airport because I'm thinking in my head, I mustn't say that, I mustn't say that. And so it comes out instead. There's also this idea of coprolalia, and copro, I think it's Latin or Greek, I can't remember. It means poo, but a slightly stronger term for poo, which I won't say in this lovely webinar. And it means poo mouth. And the idea is that it's swearing. I also have coprolalia, and that might be using inappropriate phrases that might be racist, they might be swearing and so on. But again, the intention isn't to be offensive, racist, or anything like that. It's the inability for that noise to stay within your body. There's also this idea with Tourette syndrome that there's a premonitory urge, it'd be good if I could say that word. And that's the idea that actually you feel the need to tic before it happened. You can feel it, just like that sneeze. You know it's there. Now, sometimes you can get up and you can leave and you can do that tic. Sometimes the circumstances might be, so for example, I gave the example of being in an airport. I need to go to the country I need to go to. I can see there's people in Turkmenistan and Georgia. I hope one day to visit your countries and hopefully be quieter. But it will be, I've got to go through the airport. If it's a classroom or if it's a meeting, I might leave for a moment, come back in, and so on. Now, if you're younger, you're less likely to understand, explain, or be able to kind of articulate that premonitory urge because actually it's within you. But just a bit like a child might not be able to tell you that they need to use the toilet, someone who's 7, 8, 9, 10 might not be able to feel that urge before it happens. It's kind of just out there. Tourette syndrome, in terms of a diagnosis, you have to have the tics for at least 6 months. So they kind of continual, and they can't be caused for another reason. So they can't be, I don't know, that you've taken illicit drugs and you are impulsive for another reason, for example. But also tics wax and wane, which means what might be a tic one day won't be a tic necessarily the next day. It might be. Some people are able to suppress their tics. So, for example, I am probably a master at suppressing my tics, but at some point they have to come out. There is no choice about it. So if I have a really busy day in meetings, doing lots of presentations and so on, I might find that my tics will come out later. So after this wonderful webinar, I'm going to London to meet a friend. I know that my Tourette's is going to be bad on the route to London. And I manage that in lots of different ways. And we would explore how you might be able to interpret some of those things within the classroom environment. One thing that's really important, and I'm asked it not so much now, but in the past, was if you have Tourette syndrome, are you intellectually disabled? So I'm going to talk about some of my qualifications because I think it's important that people recognise that irrespective of me having Tourette syndrome, depression, OCD, I've also got 4 children, 4 daughters who are wonderful, a 16-year-old, I've got 3-year-old twins, and I have a 2-year-old. So you can do the maths there that I had lots of children very quickly. I've also got a degree in sociology and criminology. I'm a qualified teacher. I've got a master's in inclusive education, and I'm restarting my PhD in October. I'm also a qualified head teacher, and I advise ministers around the world. The Tourette's might make things more challenging for me in terms of being accessing a learning environment and how people interpret me, but it hasn't affected my intellectual ability. My intellectual ability is regardless. So I hope that kind of clarifies things as well. So I want us to get ourselves in the classroom and thinking about what could be made different within the classroom space. Well, how can you make sure that a child that has tics, whether or not it's Tourette syndrome or otherwise, but has motor tics and vocal tics, can feel comfortable? And a piece of work I did, it must have been about 14 years ago now, was I asked about 70 people with Tourette syndrome is what things you find helpful in the classroom environment that you think would be helpful for teachers and educational professionals to understand. And so what they spoke about was different parts of the school day. We just start in the classroom, but we know that's not the beginning of a child's journey. They don't just appear in your classroom. So one thing is, actually, when you are concentrating on not ticking, if you think about cognitive load theory, that you can only have so much going on in your head at the same time, you can imagine if someone's trying to suppress their tics, for whatever reason they might not feel comfortable, then it might be really difficult to listen to teacher input because you're trying to hold too much at the same time. So one thing that's really important that people have spoken to me about is actually monitor what I'm doing. Do I understand? And actually use the classroom space to check that they're understanding the task and understanding the instructions. Now, you can do that in lots and lots of different ways. And maybe, Lauren, there's an opportunity in the future for me to be doing more work around adaptive strategies. But for example, you might have a little note on a piece of paper on their desk, which says, start like a do now task, do this, then this, so they can refer back to it. Even if they don't necessarily remember what the teacher said, they've got it in front of them. One option. The other bit is, if you're checking their understanding and you know a child has vocal tics and they're finding it difficult to get the sentence out, use mini whiteboards. Really good way of doing it. If you don't have access to mini whiteboard, one thing that's a really good thing to do, but you have access to a laminator, is laminate an A4 piece of paper and use whiteboard pens, for example. And you can check children's understanding and the whole class, whether or not they're able to speak or otherwise at any given moment, to be able to kind of check their understanding. Obviously, make sure that you look and you address misunderstandings as well. Really, really important. The other bit is, as an adult, I'm able to control my space. If, for example, during this session, I said to Lauren, I'm so sorry, Lauren, I'm really uncomfortable. Do you mind if I just leave to tick? Lauren would say, of course, no problem. And you would all talk amongst yourselves and it would be fine. Now, sometimes our schooling environments make that more difficult for lots of different reasons. We also know that children are wonderful, silly, great creatures, and they might not want to be in the classroom for lots of other reasons as well. But allowing students to access a private, comfortable area to tick without disrupting the class has been noted to be uncomfortable. Now, that's not to say that children can't tick in the class. You need to reflect back to the child about where they find things more comfortable. Now, for me, I would feel mortified ticking in front of my mother-in-law, for example, especially some of the things I mentioned, coprolalia, especially some of the things that I might say might be sexually orientated or racist and things like that. Not very nice. I would much prefer to leave that space and go away somewhere else. I was absolutely blessed to go to Kosovo at the weekend. I would I would not want to tick in front of some of my colleagues because I don't know them very well. And so I need a safe place to tick. But other times I might be more than happy to tick in front of other people. It depends on the situation. And you can routinely arrange your classroom environment to ask the child, where would you feel most comfortable sitting? And for them to just, back of the class, for example, where they can tick as well. And people might not even notice. They might not even have to leave. So that's one thing, thinking about your classroom space in that way. I also want to think about sensory accommodations and how you can use those things to think about it. Now, I'm not an occupational therapist, I'm a teacher by trade. But things that some of the children have spoken to me about is often their mouths might be clenching. They might want to, some children spit with Tourette's as well as a tic. I know that I have, it's not very nice. But allowing children to chew gum, which I hate gum, by the way, I hate gum. But allowing children to chew gum, because actually it can relieve the physical tics like jaw clenching when you're just like doing that, can be really, really important. But also things like, so for example, sometimes I punch my chest. If I'm sitting on the sofa, I will just put the cushion there. So I'm not actually punching my chest because that hurts and it bruises it, that I've got something that softens my tic without stopping myself tick. Like I said, it's like a sneeze, has to come out at some point. Things like fidget toys can be really helpful, especially if you find that there's lots of tics with their fingers and so on. Again, I'm not a huge fan of fidget toys. I think they can be noisy and distracting, but so I'm going to think of you as teachers and people in the classroom. And some people have recommended sewing a button in the pocket of a child so they can get the sensory feedback of flicking the button back and forth. No one can see it. It's private. It doesn't make awful amount of noise. And actually, sometimes what people have said is if I know that my mum has sewn that button in or my dad, then I'm reminded of my mum and that's calming as well. So it's another layer of that fidget toy. Simple, it's cheap. Most people can sew a button into a pocket. I need to sew some buttons onto my coat later, so I need to remember that when I do that later. The other bit is some people might feel comfortable ticking when they're moving around because actually they may wish to disguise their tics, they might not want to, but actually it helps also to release that pent-up energy. Remember at the beginning I said in terms of neurodiversity, you might have what's called comorbidity, so diagnosis after diagnosis, ADHD, Tourette's, and so on. So actually having opportunities to give out books, for example, to go and get a pen, to be a kind of helpful member, or even thinking about your teaching strategies and your adaptive teaching strategies to make sure that children aren't just sitting at a desk or sitting on the floor, that there's moments where they can move around and be part of the classroom in different ways as well, and using their physicality. And actually, that helps for me. Like sometimes I might need to run round the living room because my tics are everywhere. And obviously, in the living room, that's fine. My husband and my children don't care. But people might want to have that space in which to do that as well. So thinking about how you might use your outside environment too. I also want to think about transitions and unstructured time. For me, I find those are the most difficult times in which I manage my Tourette's. And part of that is transitions are really overstimulating. Actually, if you think about, so I mentioned the airport, there's lots and lots of people all over, like everywhere. There's noises, there's sounds, there's lights. In the schooling space, it can be quite similar and quite overwhelming. That actually you're looking to go to the right place, There might be crowded hallways, it might be quite busy, and so on. And actually, that can be overwhelming in itself, moving from one place to another. Now, what you might want to consider is some children have really benefited from actually allowing them to leave a few minutes early so they can avoid that chaos of those main transition periods. That can be one bit. You might want to have a buddy system where they go with a friend as well. So that kind of brings in that security. And so one thing that I did yesterday before I went to the theatre is my husband met me at the train station, which meant that I didn't have to remember what I said about cognitive load. I didn't have to work out where the theatre was and tick and people looking at me and feeling like, esteem issues. He met me. He walked me to the station. He was my buddy. I'm sure my wedding was more than just a buddy system, but it meant he got me without me having to worry and try and figure out everything at the same time. Those things are really important, actually. And sometimes we forget that the class education and school isn't just the classroom, it's the time waiting, it's a time in between, it's playtime as well that can be really difficult and really challenging for lots of reasons. It goes without saying, I don't think we can talk about inclusion unless we talk about a communication and collaboration. Always ask the child. Don't assume. Actually, they are the one that is responsible for their Tourette's, how they tick, and how they manage and what they feel comfortable with. Just because you might not feel comfortable with X, it doesn't mean that they don't. They might feel entirely comfortable. And one thing that I find is that other children are incredibly understanding. And sometimes what I've done is assemblies for parents and carers and children and going, this is what Tourette's is. And you might have noticed that one of your other children in your school has Tourette's. This is how it affects me. And I answer their questions. So that open communication is really important. But just because I've got Tourette's, it doesn't mean I know what someone else with Tourette's will want. So make sure you talk to them. And if they're not able to express themselves for lots of different reasons, then make sure that you're talking with parents and you're having those kind of collaborative conversations as well. But also, what you might implement, all those things that I've just said, might not work. Actually, those children might not want to leave the classroom. They might not want to be at the back of the classroom. This is me just gathering ideas from other people. What does that child want? What does that child feel comfortable with? And how do you monitor it and make sure you have that continuous feedback? That's really important that you're collaborating together, but also to make sure there's a consistent approach. If you know, for example, in one subject area, a child is able to manage easier for whatever reason, find out why. And it's not a blame game on the other teacher. It's to go, what are you doing differently? Or what are you establishing that I can replicate in my classroom or my playground or my relationship to make sure that this child thrives? Really important. And again, make sure you're honest and you have those ongoing conversations. If, say, for example, you notice that a child is ticking a lot, I don't think you need to ignore it. You can say, is there anything I can do to support? That's all you need to say. And the child might say, no, I'm okay. I also want to add one thing. Sometimes people think that Tourette's is all about when you're stressed or that you're worried or that you're anxious. I tick so much when I'm excited, when I'm really, really looking forward to it. So not only am I really excited about going to other countries and I'm ticking, I've also got the chaos of the transition as well. So that's probably why it's my worst place is airports. So think about that as well. It might not be because someone is anxious or depressed. It might be because they're super excited about something. And be aware of that. So if you've got a really exciting event in your school, so for example, you might have someone who's famous coming into school. You might have, owls coming into school, or they might be going on an educational visit. That might also mean that they're a bit excited, so their tics might become more obvious. Peer support's really really important, because actually that's what fosters understanding. I don't think we can undersell about the idea of educating others about Tourette syndrome and making sure we dispel myths. This is why I'm here today. And I said to you, hopefully articulately, doesn't affect, even if it did, then hopefully you would still be kind and wonderful, but it doesn't affect my cognition. Like, don't assume things. Find out about the facts of Tourette syndrome and share it with children. And now that's not to say that you say, oh, actually, Elvira, you have Tourette's, and I want you to tell everyone about it. Ask the child what they feel comfortable with, if anything. But also, you can do things like read literature around Tourette syndrome as well, stories or craft stories about Tourette. So you're kind of demystifying without necessarily pointing to someone who may or may not feel comfortable with it as well. The other thing is, one thing that works really well is peer mentors. So someone who doesn't have Tourette's, for example, advocating when the child might not be able to advocate as well, and act as a kind of maybe or even somebody with Tourette's who's older, acting as a peer mentor as well. And that's what I've done as a female. I would mentor younger children, girls in particular, around actually there is no stopping you. You can do whatever you want to do. So making sure that those peer mentor relationships are there as well and people understand. The other element is making sure that you're not just thinking about your schooling space, your classrooms, but are there other activities that you do that actually marginalise children with Tourette's for lots of different ways? And what's that about? So, for example, if you are going to a theatre and you know that a child with Tourette's will not be able to manage that 2 hours of theatre, even with an hour interval, whatever it might be, is it the case that you can let them know in advance that they can, and they sit at the back, for example, and they can come and go and tick as they want? Is it that you need to look at something alternative? So I went to a really interesting theatre space. It sounds like I go to the theatre all the time. I haven't been for years, but I've decided to go to the theatre more. I went to a theatre space a couple of weeks ago, and they also had filming being broadcast in the outside spaces so that people that were autistic or had Tourette's and things like that could leave the space and come back if they were overwhelmed, especially because there's a lot of sensory bits. And actually, sometimes it's about being innovative and creative and having those conversations too. So think about that, not just a theatre, but it might be the zoo and all manner of different things. But also, again, that peer support where actually children might be able to go, whether or not they're autistic, they have ADHD, where designated areas where they don't have to be on their own either, but where they can feel that they can tick without being comfortable, without judgment as well. I'm not advocating for hiding people with Tourette's in little spaces on their own, but actually thinking about how can we make sure people feel comfortable. Many of your children that you work with Tourette's will go on post compulsory education. And one bit, or they might go to a different school. So you might want to think about that. One thing that people spoke to me about was actually identifying that key contact. So actually, if they're going to a college or to a workplace, actually, is there somewhere a key person they can talk to make sure they can have a walk around the site, for example? They can look what it looks like, they can look at the lighting and so on and feel how comfortable they are with it, but also that they're able to express if they're going to find, they think they might find things difficult, they might need more support. But also, when you're thinking about those transition points, actually discuss what accommodations might be helpful. So actually, do they need extra time? Do they need, for example, during exam periods, private testing spaces? Because obviously exams are quite difficult and stressful. And do they need 25% extra time in order for them to tick, be able to come back to their work and so on? So sometimes tics can mean it takes longer to write a piece of work, for example, because you are engaging with certain physical activity before you can write. It's really important, and hopefully I've demonstrated this. Actually, we don't want to talk for people. We want people to be advocates and self-advocates. And actually, I will tell you what I need from you. Please don't assume. And generally speaking, I don't need anything from you. It's great. But for some, they might say, you know what? I would like to make sure I always sit at the edge in the classroom. Make sure that people have the opportunity to be their own self-advocates, especially as they get older as well, because that's what inclusion's about, isn't it? About making sure that voices aren't marginalised, especially if they're considered to have a disability as well. The other element is thinking with the child about what are their coping strategies. And sometimes tics hurt. You know, if I've mentioned about hitting my chest and so on, that actually What does that look like? What are their coping strategies to be able to manage that? And I mentioned the cushion, but it might be that I go out and watch the birds, for example. What does that look like? And how do we make sure that we're communicating it and beyond? But also actually thinking about your best transition planning and how do you make sure that that child is able to navigate the new setting? How are they are able to establish their routines and build a support system within their new environment? So, this is where I think I get to open up to questions. You will see on your screen as well, there is a QR code, but also my link tree. One thing that's really important to me is that I improve my practice and so on. If you feel that there's things that I've missed out, obviously there's opportunities to ask questions, but also you can write it on the survey if you don't want to kind of ask in public and so on. But what that does, it helps me improve what I'm doing. I also I've sent it to Lauren as well, but on my website, I've got a whole document on my website, which is completely free to use, which is about Tourette syndrome in the classroom. It's a bit old fashioned looking now because I need to review it. But please download it. And I've got lots and lots of other resources around emotional regulation and so on. So I'm going to open up to chat if that's all right. Everyone's very polite. I'm going to sip my tea as well as being a very British person.
Sarah, this was wow. Like I just learned so much. And I tried to put all of the resources and ideas that you shared in the shared Padlet. So those of you who've been following as a
Brilliant.
resource, yeah, they're in there. And I'll drop the link from your website as well. But yes, please feel free to
Amazing.
questions, comments in the chat.
Oh, thank you, Lauren.
I think what you've done, Sarah, is that because you're so vulnerable to share so openly about your experience, you have given us just this really wonderful picture into what it's like to have Tourette's and OCD that not only educates us and gives us information, but also builds compassion and empathy and more understanding. So I don't know how to express how much I appreciate the vulnerability that you have to share because it's just normalizes Tourette's in a way that it's something that we may not have known about before we came on this webinar. Thank you.
No, it's a pleasure. And um I remember so I was diagnosed with Tourette's just after the birth of my child. So I had OCD, my 16-year-old. I had OCD during my pregnancy. I'd had Tourette's before. You have to have tics in childhood. That's probably something I hadn't mentioned. And so some of my friends would call me squeaker. So I would squeak and make noises. But for whatever reason, after the birth of my first daughter, my Tourette's became so much worse to the extent that it interrupted my life fundamentally. So I love singing. I'm not very good at singing, but I love singing. But I couldn't sing a song because I was just ticking all the way through. And the one place that I don't tick is when I teach. And sometimes people talk about there's some people talk about singing and they don't need to tick, like that's their safe place. For me, it's teaching, which is quite wonderful in a way. And yeah, so I remember my husband saying to me at the time, he said, he played a video of somebody with Tourette's in the UK that's done some BBC kind of articles and things, and there's just been a film came out. And he said to me, "Tell me how you're different to him." And I suppose seeing somebody with Tourette's and thinking, "Oh yeah," and like, and I knew Tourette's, like I had friends with Tourette's and things like that, but I hadn't kind of interpreted it myself. And interestingly, people would describe me as neurodiverse. I don't see myself as neurodiverse at all. And that's why I think it's really important to ask people how they see themselves. I see myself as neurotypical. I just happen to have Tourette's and mental health difficulties. But lots of other people are going, oh, no, no, I'm neurodiverse and I have Tourette's. And that's fine, I think, as well. It's how people see themselves.
That's something we talked about a few sessions ago in the session that I led. How important it is to ask people how they want to identify themselves. Like the conversation around disability first language versus not, right? Some people want to say I'm an autistic person, and some people want to still say I'm a person with autism or I have autism. So it matters how people want to identify themselves.
And I think
Yep.
that's the thing, isn't it? So some people, and I'm really mindful of that in some of the books that I've written around social, emotional, mental health, about autism in particular, that, some people really critique the idea of, well, I don't carry autism around like it's a handbag. But actually, other people I've spoken about going, no, this is not a defining feature of me. And it's what you want, isn't it? Like,
So you have to have a conversation.
It doesn't make a difference to me. So yeah, it's what, yeah, have the conversation. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the link directly to the survey. And as I said, it's so important for me if you could fill it in. I know people don't necessarily like doing surveys, but I really do learn from it and go, actually, what can I do better? And that's really important to me because, what I don't want is you to be sitting here thinking, oh, this is an awful session. And I don't know about it because then I can't change it because I don't know what you experience. So let me put that in chat for you as well. Yeah, so what strategy has been helpful regarding my physical action? So I mentioned touching and things like that. And I think I'm very aware of my physicality. So you can't see, but I will tell you I'm 5'1", I'm 8 stone. No one apart from myself or smaller children or things like that are going to be hurt if I hit. But one of the things that I manage it is I will always sit next to a big person at a meal and they know that I've got Tourette's and I will do my best. But also if I hit them, I'm a 5'1", 8 stone woman. It's probably not going to hurt them when my husband's 6'5". It's not why I married him, but it's helpful. So that if I hit or touch, then I don't feel awkward about it. It's also about surrounding myself with people that understand me. But I'm also aware that there might be times when that's not possible and I will move myself away. So if I don't know somebody, if I'm on a train and I know that my tics are touching other people, that's not comfortable for them necessarily. I will move away to my own space and giving me that capacity. So if you imagine in your classroom, if a child knows that they want to touch or their tic is to touch, then actually, is that other person comfortable with it? Because they might not be, even if they say they are. And how do you kind of reduce that for them? And it might be that actually they decide to sit on their own as well, because you also don't want to expose another child to being touched without consent, because that's not comfortable either. I'm well aware that I'm a woman, but actually, thinking about boys as well, that actually might not be comfortable for them to sit next to girls for those sorts of reasons, because also there's a bit of a taboo issue that I think, especially with the kind of coprolalia elements of swearing and those kind of, as I said, the poo mouth, but actually also with touching, it can be like, I mustn't do that. I mustn't do that. I mustn't do that. I've done it. And that can be even more difficult if it's a man, I think. But also it can be, I think that boys and men are more at risk. So for example, if I shout something offensive, people will see it as a tic. If I am a 6-foot boy, I think that's less likely. Thinking about those strategies are really important.
See, an educator, I'm waiting to see if anyone else has any more questions, but there may not be. This has been really, really informative, and we're so appreciative to you for leading us through this.
And no, it's a pleasure. And I really value questions afterwards. So don't feel obliged either. You're more than welcome to contact me thereafter and ask questions. And this is recorded so people can listen back. Oh my goodness. Oh, that's a bit exciting. I'll reshare it. I know. I should have done my hair better actually, and not worn a hoodie. Hey, let's pretend. But no, it's great. And actually, if we can educate and support more people in developing their understanding around inclusive practices, whether or not it's Tourette's or otherwise, then what a grand job and what a lovely way to spend. For me in England, it's a Tuesday afternoon. What a lovely way to spend a Tuesday afternoon. It's really valuable.
Exactly. Absolutely. That's the whole hope from the webinar, right? Just that more people have more access to this learning. So more kids around the world are getting what they need in our schools and in communities of belonging. So thank you, Sarah. Thanks so much. And thank you all for being here. We hope you'll join us next week for, I think, 3 more sessions. So we hope to see you then. And if not,
Amazing.
then sign up and you can always watch it when it comes out on YouTube. But thank you all so much.
Just got one more question. Is there an age where people usually receive the diagnosis? It will be different depending on the country in which you live in. Generally speaking, I would say around puberty is where the diagnosis becomes probably more obvious, because I think the differences become more obvious. Mine was a really late diagnosis. That would be unusual. I would say probably around 14, 15, 16-ish. Slightly younger, depending on puberty. Not that it's linked to puberty, but it's just more likely to be kind of diagnosed afterwards in kind of more adolescent phases. Some people may never get a diagnosis because they don't have the clinical pathways in lots of different ways as well.
That's a great question.
Great question. Yeah, it's a great question.
And so many of the strategies you've shared will work for so many kids in so many different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm gonna stop recording, but thank you all so much for joining us. And Sarah, will you just hang
Thank
tight for a
you.
minute? It's still uploading, actually. Okay. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you all. See you next week.
Bye bye. Take care.